Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest stories. The summer of 1978 hung heavy over the small town of Millfield, Pennsylvania. Nixon had resigned 4 years prior, and the country was still reeling from the cultural whiplash that followed the free love era of the 60s. Fleetwood Mac's rumors played endlessly on FM radio stations while Star Wars posters adorned bedroom walls of teenagers dreaming of galaxies far away. It was July 23rd, and the mercury had climbed to 93 degrees by noon, the kind of heat that made the asphalt bubble and time itself seem to slow to a crawl. In a modest 2-story colonial home on Sycamore Street, 18-year-old Elizabeth Blackwell was packing her suitcase, carefully folding bell-bottom jeans and peasant blouses, while her younger sister, Abigail, 16, lounged on the twin bed beside hers. The room was typical of teenage girls in the 70s. Posters of John Travolta from Saturday Night Fever competed for wall space with Farrah Fawcett's iconic red swimsuit image. A turntable in the corner held stacks of vinyl records. Fleetwood Mac, Linda Ronstadt, and Carly Simon. Elizabeth, or Lizzie as everyone called her, had graduated from Millfield High School just a month earlier. She was preparing to leave for Penn State in September, the first in her family to attend college. She planned to study education, dreaming of returning to Millfield to teach at the elementary school. With long auburn hair that fell in natural waves, bright hazel eyes, and a spray of freckles across her nose, Lizzie was both beautiful and intelligent. She was the pride of the Blackwell family. "I wish you weren't going," Abigail said, twirling a strand of her honey-blonde hair, "as you're in my heart." By Rod Stewart drifted from the portable radio on their dresser. "Who's going to protect me from Dad when he drinks?" "Mom will," Lizzie said, though her voice lacked conviction. She folded a denim skirt and placed it carefully in the suitcase. "And I'll be home for Thanksgiving." It's only 3 months. What nobody knew was that Elizabeth Blackwell would never make it to college. By nightfall, both Blackwell sisters would vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and a community shocked to its core. That evening, Mary Blackwell returned from her shift at Woolworth's department store to an empty house. Her husband, Richard, was at his weekly bowling league, but the girls were supposed to be home. The television was on, tuned to the Love Boat. Dishes from lunch sat unwashed in the sink. Mary called out for her daughters, but the only response was the ticking of the cuckoo clock in the hallway and the muffled sound of Charlie's Angels from the neighbor's television set. By 10 that night, when Richard Blackwell stumbled home smelling of beer and cigarettes, Mary had already called all of Elizabeth and Abigail's friends. No one had seen them since mid-afternoon, when they were spotted walking toward the path that led to Lake Morrison, a popular swimming spot for local teenagers. Richard, despite his inebriated state, immediately sobered at the news. He grabbed the keys to his Ford LTD and drove to the lake, the yellow headlights cutting through the darkness as crickets chirped in the July heat. At the lake, Richard found nothing but the girls' bicycles chained to a tree. Their towels were spread on the shore, but there was no other sign of Elizabeth or Abigail. A half-eaten package of Twinkies and 2 bottles of Tab soda sat on one of the towels. Richard called out their names until his voice grew hoarse, the sound echoing across the still water. By midnight, Chief Daniel Morgan of the Millfield Police Department had organized a search party. Officers with flashlights combed the shoreline while volunteers from town trudged through the surrounding woods. The department's single patrol boat searched the lake with spotlights, the beams dancing across the black surface of the water. By dawn, the search had yielded nothing but exhaustion and growing dread. The disappearance of the Blackwell sisters became the lead story on WPEN radio that morning. As Neil Diamond's Sweet Caroline faded out, the somber voice of the news announcer detailed what little was known about the missing girls. By afternoon, their school photos were taped to the windows of every business on Main Street. The headline of the Millfield Chronicle read, "Local Teens Vanish from Lake Morrison." In 1978, there were no Amber Alerts, no cell phones to ping, no social media to spread the word instantly. There was only the agonizing, methodical process of knocking on doors, making phone calls on rotary phones, and printing flyers on mimeograph machines that left the searchers' fingers stained purple with ink. Chief Morgan established a command center in the high school gymnasium. Folding tables were set up with push-button telephones where volunteers logged calls and tips. A large map of Millfield and the surrounding county was pinned to a bulletin board with colored pins marking the areas already searched. The smell of percolating coffee and cigarette smoke hung in the air as town residents gathered to help find the Blackwell girls. In the initial days of the investigation, several leads emerged. A gas station attendant reported seeing a dark-colored van with out-of-state plates near the lake around the time the girls disappeared. 3 teenagers claimed they heard screams coming from the north shore of the lake, though they admitted they had been drinking Coors beer stolen from one of their fathers. And the girl's friend, Jessica Turner, told police that Elizabeth had mentioned a secret boyfriend who was older and not from around here. Chief Morgan and his team of 4 officers worked around the clock, running license plate checks through the state police, interviewing everyone who had been at the lake that day, and dragging the bottom of Lake Morrison. They collected what physical evidence they could: cigarette butts found near the girls' towels, tire tracks from the dirt road leading to the lake, and fingerprints from the soda bottles. But without sophisticated forensic technology, these clues led nowhere. Richard and Mary Blackwell appeared on the local television news, Mary clutching a tissue and Richard looking haggard and pale. "Please," Mary begged, her voice breaking, "if anyone knows anything about our girls, please come forward. We just want them home." As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to stall. The FBI sent an agent to assist, but without concrete evidence of abduction across state lines, their involvement was limited. Psychics from as far away as Philadelphia arrived in town, offering their services to the desperate parents. One claimed the girls were being held in a cabin in the mountains. Another insisted they had run away to California to join a commune. None of these leads panned out. By Labor Day, when Elizabeth should have been moving into her dormitory at Penn State, the daily searches had dwindled. The command center was dismantled. The gymnasium returned to its original purpose as students prepared for the new school year. The Blackwell case remained open, but active investigation slowed to a trickle of occasional follow-ups and review of existing evidence. What no one knew then was that the truth was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined, and the answers would remain hidden for nearly 4 decades. As the 1970s gave way to the 80s, the Blackwell case grew colder. The missing posters featuring the smiling faces of Elizabeth and Abigail faded in shop windows, eventually replaced by advertisements for Cabbage Patch Kids and announcements of the town's bicentennial celebration. The case became a dark chapter in Millfield's history, a cautionary tale parents told their children to warn them about the dangers of going off alone. Mary Blackwell never recovered from the loss of her daughters. She quit her job at Woolworth's and rarely left the house on Sycamore Street. Neighbors would see her sitting on the front porch, staring vacantly at the street, as if waiting for her girls to come pedaling home on their bicycles. Richard Blackwell threw himself into his work at the paper mill, taking double shifts and volunteering for overtime. At night, he drank himself into oblivion at Brady's Tavern, stumbling home long after Mary had cried herself to sleep. On the first anniversary of the disappearance, Mary organized a candlelight vigil at Lake Morrison. Nearly the entire town attended, holding white tapers that flickered in the summer breeze as a local minister led prayers for the missing girls. The following year, fewer people came. By the 5th anniversary, only Mary, Richard, and a handful of the girls' closest friends stood by the shore, remembering. Every year on the girls' birthdays, Mary would bake a cake and set the table for 5 places for herself, Richard, Elizabeth, Abigail, and Chief Morgan, who dutifully came to dinner to assure the Blackwells that the case remained open. He would bring the case file, now stored in a cardboard box in the basement of the police station, and review the evidence once more, though there was nothing new to find. Through the Reagan years and into the Clinton administration, the Blackwell case gathered dust. The officers who had worked the original investigation retired or moved away. Chief Morgan himself passed away in 1993, taking with him his personal knowledge of the case. The new chief, a young man from Philadelphia who had no connection to the events of '78, relegated the Blackwell files to the archives, alongside records of prohibition raids and minutes from town council meetings of decades past. Mary Blackwell died in 2004, never knowing what happened to her daughters. Richard, who had been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver, followed her 6 months later. They were buried side by side in Millfield Cemetery, beneath a headstone that read, "Beloved Parents of Elizabeth and Abigail." 2 smaller markers flanked their grave, memorials for daughters whose bodies were never found. The house on Sycamore Street was sold to a young couple from Pittsburgh who renovated it completely, unaware of its tragic history until neighbors told them about the Blackwell girls. In the attic, the new owners found a box of the girls' belongings, yearbooks, diaries, and photographs that Mary had preserved. Not knowing what else to do with these artifacts of grief, they donated them to the Millfield Historical Society, where they were cataloged and stored away. Meanwhile, the world changed around the frozen moment of the Blackwell's disappearance. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet transformed communication. Cell phones replaced payphones. DNA testing revolutionized forensic science. Cold cases across the country were being solved through technologies that would have seemed like science fiction in 1978. And then, in the spring of 2017, nearly 39 years after Elizabeth and Abigail vanished, a discovery at Lake Morrison would blow the dust off the Blackwell case and set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring the truth to light. It began with a drought, the worst in Pennsylvania's recorded history. As water levels at Lake Morrison receded to historic lows, areas of the lake bed that had been submerged for generations became exposed. A group of environmental science students from Millfield Community College were conducting a study on the impact of the drought when they made a grisly discovery. Near what had once been the north shore of the lake, now nearly 30 yards from the current waterline, one of the students spotted something protruding from the cracked, dry mud. At first, she thought it was driftwood, bleached by years underwater. But as she knelt to examine it, she realized with horror that she was looking at human remains, a partial skeleton embedded in the sediment. The Millfield Police Department, now equipped with modern forensic training and technology, secured the area. The county medical examiner and a forensic anthropologist from the University of Pittsburgh carefully excavated the site, recovering not 1, but 2 sets of human remains. The bones had been preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor environment at the bottom of the lake, protected from the elements and predators that would normally scatter such evidence. Initial analysis indicated the remains belonged to 2 young females, one approximately 18 years of age, the other slightly younger. Both had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The anthropologist estimated they had been in the lake for several decades. Heavy stones had been tied to the bodies with what appeared to be electrical cord, but as the cord deteriorated over time, the remains had shifted with the lake's currents. Detective Samantha Riley, who had joined the Millfield Police Department just 3 years earlier, was assigned to the case. As she reviewed the medical examiner's findings, a sense of recognition began to form. Born and raised in Philadelphia, Riley had no personal connection to the Blackwell case, but she recalled seeing a display at the Historical Society that mentioned the town's most notorious unsolved mystery. Riley drove to the Millfield Historical Society, housed in a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street. The curator, Harold Jenkins, was an elderly man who had lived in Millfield his entire life. When Riley asked about the Blackwell sisters, Jenkins led her to a glass case in a back room where photographs of Elizabeth and Abigail smiled out from beneath a layer of dust. "I was in high school when they disappeared," Jenkins told Riley. "Everyone thought they'd been kidnapped, maybe taken out of state. No one imagined they might have been in the lake all this time." Riley obtained dental records that had been preserved in the original case file. The medical examiner confirmed what Riley had already suspected. The remains from the lake were those of Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell. But identifying the victims was only the beginning. Now, Riley faced the daunting task of solving a murder that had occurred before she was born. The original investigators were dead or scattered. Witnesses' memories would have faded. Evidence had been lost or degraded. And yet, Riley felt a responsibility to the Blackwell sisters and to a town that had never fully recovered from their loss. She began by digitizing the entire case file: police reports, witness statements, photographs, and notes from the original investigation. She created a digital timeline of the girls' last known movements and a database of everyone mentioned in the reports. Riley reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for assistance in creating a profile of the killer based on the evidence available. One of the first people Riley interviewed was Jessica Turner, now Jessica Mitchell, who had been Elizabeth's best friend in high school. In her 60s now, with grown children and grandchildren of her own, Jessica still remembered the summer of '78 with perfect clarity. "I've lived with the guilt all these years," Jessica told Riley in her living room, surrounded by family photos and houseplants. "I knew about the man Lizzie was seeing, but I promised not to tell." "If I had spoken up sooner, maybe." Riley leaned forward. "What man, Mrs. Mitchell?" Jessica twisted her wedding ring nervously. "She wouldn't tell me his name. Said it was complicated and I wouldn't understand. But she did say he was older and that they had to keep it secret because people wouldn't approve. I always assumed it was a teacher or someone like that." This was consistent with what Jessica had told the original investigators, but Riley pressed for more details. Did Elizabeth ever mention where they met or how long they'd been seeing each other? Jessica closed her eyes, trying to recall conversations from nearly 4 decades earlier. She said something about him giving her rides home sometimes. "And I remember she started wearing this necklace, a small silver heart. She said it was a gift from him." Riley made a note about the necklace, which hadn't been mentioned in any of the original reports. She then asked about Abigail. "Abby worshipped Lizzie," Jessica said, "followed her everywhere, wanted to be just like her. If Lizzie had a secret boyfriend, Abby would have known about it." Armed with this information, Riley returned to the evidence collected from the lake. Among the items recovered near the remains were several pieces of jewelry: a charm bracelet, a class ring identified as Elizabeth's, and a silver heart necklace, tarnished by years underwater but still intact. The forensic team had also recovered scraps of clothing and the electrical cord used to bind the stones to the victims. Modern DNA testing might be able to extract information that would have been impossible to detect in 1978. Riley sent the evidence to the state crime lab, requesting comprehensive DNA analysis as well as testing for any chemical residues that might have survived. While waiting for the results, she continued her investigation, tracking down other friends and acquaintances of the Blackwell sisters. Most had little to add to what was already known, but one name kept coming up in conversations: James Harper, who had been a senior when Elizabeth was a junior. Several people remembered that he had asked Elizabeth to prom, but she had declined. Harper had joined the Navy after graduation and, according to local knowledge, had never returned to Millfield. Riley tracked Harper to a suburb of Chicago where he worked as an electrical engineer. Now in his late 50s, Harper seemed genuinely shocked to learn that the Blackwell sisters' remains had been found. He confirmed that he had been interested in Elizabeth, but said she had told him she was seeing someone else. When Riley pressed for details, Harper recalled that Elizabeth had once mentioned meeting her boyfriend at the place where her father worked. Richard Blackwell had been employed at the Millfield Paper Mill, which had closed in 1996 and been demolished to make way for a shopping center. Riley obtained employment records from the company's archives, looking for any man who might have had contact with Elizabeth. Meanwhile, the DNA results came back from the state lab. The electrical cord used to bind the stones to the victims contained traces of DNA that had been protected from degradation by the lake water. The lab had extracted a partial profile, not enough for a definitive identification, but enough to compare against a suspect if one emerged. Chemical analysis of the girls' clothing revealed traces of paper mill chemicals, specifically those used in the pulping process. This suggested they had been in contact with someone or something from the mill shortly before their deaths. Riley was building a theory. Elizabeth had been seeing someone connected to the paper mill where her father worked. This person had somehow lured both sisters to a secluded location, killed them, and disposed of their bodies in the lake. But who was this mystery man, and was he still alive after all these years? The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, the box of personal effects that had been donated to the Historical Society. Among Elizabeth's belongings was a diary with entries spanning from January to July 1978. The final entry was dated July 22nd, the day before the sisters disappeared. As Riley read through the diary, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Elizabeth wrote about R and their secret relationship. She described feeling both excited and guilty about their meetings. In one entry, she wrote, "R says we can go away together, just the three of us. He says he can get a job anywhere with his skills, and no one would ever have to know." But what about Mom? The entry from July 22nd was the most revealing. R says everything is arranged. Tomorrow at the lake. A new start for all of us. Abby's excited but scared too. I told her it will be an adventure. R says once we're gone, we can be a real family. No more hiding. Riley felt a chill as she realized the implications of what she was reading. She cross-referenced the diary entries with the employment records from the paper mill. Richard Blackwell had worked in the pulping department. His supervisor's evaluation described him as skilled but temperamental, and noted several incidents of inappropriate behavior toward female employees. Further examination of the original case file revealed something that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. Richard Blackwell had reported finding the girls' bicycles and belongings at the lake, but no one had questioned how he knew exactly where to look when there were several popular swimming spots around Lake Morrison. The picture was becoming clearer, and it was more horrific than anyone could have imagined. Riley believed that Richard Blackwell had been engaged in an inappropriate relationship with his own daughter, Elizabeth. When she planned to leave for college, he convinced her and Abigail to meet him at the lake, possibly promising to take them away to start a new life. Instead, he murdered them both and weighted their bodies down in the lake. But Riley needed more than theory and circumstantial evidence. Richard Blackwell was long dead, but if she could prove he was the killer, she could finally close the case and bring some measure of peace to the community that had been haunted by the mystery for nearly 4 decades. She requested an exhumation order for Richard Blackwell's remains. If DNA from his body matched the partial profile found on the electrical cord, it would confirm her suspicions. The district attorney, initially reluctant to disturb a grave based on a theory, eventually agreed when Riley presented the diary entries and the accumulation of circumstantial evidence. While waiting for the exhumation to be approved and carried out, Riley continued investigating Richard Blackwell's history. She discovered that in 1977, a year before his daughter's disappearance, he had been questioned in connection with an incident involving a 17-year-old female employee at the paper mill. The girl had claimed he made inappropriate advances, but no charges were filed after Richard claimed it was a misunderstanding. The girl and her family moved away shortly afterward. Riley tracked down this woman, now living in Arizona. In a phone interview, she confirmed that Richard Blackwell had attempted to initiate a sexual relationship with her and had become threatening when she refused. "He told me he had special relationships with his daughters," the woman recalled. "He said they understood him in ways other women didn't. It was creepy, but back then, people didn't talk about that kind of thing." This corroborating testimony strengthened Riley's case. When Richard Blackwell's remains were finally exhumed, DNA testing confirmed what Riley had suspected. The genetic material on the electrical cord was consistent with Richard Blackwell's DNA profile. Furthermore, forensic analysis of Richard's tools, which had been preserved among his effects, showed that the cutting pattern on the electrical cord matched his wire cutters. On a cold morning in November 2017, Detective Samantha Riley stood before a press conference in the Millfield Town Hall. Cameras flashed as she announced that the Blackwell case was officially closed. Richard Blackwell, father of Elizabeth and Abigail, had murdered his own daughters and concealed their bodies in Lake Morrison. Evidence suggests that Richard Blackwell had been sexually abusing at least one of his daughters, Riley stated to a stunned audience. When Elizabeth planned to leave for college, threatening to end his control and possibly expose him, he killed both girls to silence them. He then participated in the search efforts, effectively hiding in plain sight. The revelation sent shockwaves through Millfield. Those who had known the Blackwell family struggled to reconcile their memories with the horrible truth. Some recalled Richard's controlling behavior and Mary's subdued demeanor as possible signs they had missed. Others remembered how Richard had insisted on driving the girls to school events and activities, rarely allowing them independence. For those who had lived in Millfield since 1978, the closure of the case brought mixed emotions. There was relief that the mystery had finally been solved, but profound sadness at the truth that had remained hidden for so long. Many questioned how such a terrible secret could have existed in their close-knit community without detection. A memorial service was held for Elizabeth and Abigail at the shore of Lake Morrison. Hundreds attended, including many who had participated in the original search nearly 4 decades earlier. Jessica Mitchell placed flowers on the water, finally able to say goodbye to her childhood friend. Harold Jenkins from the Historical Society arranged for a permanent exhibit about the case, not to sensationalize the tragedy, but to ensure that the community would remember the Blackwell sisters and perhaps be more vigilant in protecting vulnerable children in the future. The remains of Elizabeth and Abigail were reinterred in Millfield Cemetery, not beside their parents as originally planned, but in a separate location with a new headstone that read simply, Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, beloved sisters, finally at peace. In the years following the resolution of the Blackwell case, Detective Riley became an advocate for cold case investigations and better resources for victims of family abuse. She often cited the Blackwell case in her presentations to law enforcement agencies across the country, emphasizing how advances in forensic science could bring justice even decades after a crime. The tragedy of the Blackwell sisters also led to positive changes in Millfield itself. The town established a crisis center for victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse, named Lizzie's Place in memory of Elizabeth Blackwell. Schools implemented more comprehensive education programs about recognizing and reporting abuse. And the police department created a dedicated cold case unit to ensure that no unsolved crime would ever again be forgotten. For Detective Samantha Riley, the Blackwell case was both a professional triumph and a profound lesson in the persistence of truth. Justice delayed is not always justice denied, she often said. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right person to bring it into the light. The lake that had held the secret of the Blackwell sisters for nearly 4 decades now serves as a place of reflection and remembrance. A small plaque at the shoreline tells their story, not as victims of an unsolved mystery, but as young women whose lives were cut tragically short and whose truth, though long submerged, eventually rose to the surface. In solving the Blackwell case, Riley and her team had accomplished something remarkable. They had given voice to victims who had been silenced for nearly 40 years. They had proven that time could not erase the evidence of truth, that secrets buried in lake mud and human hearts would eventually be revealed. As the waters of Lake Morrison gradually returned to their normal levels, covering once again the spot where Elizabeth and Abigail had rested for so long, the town of Millfield began its own healing process. The horrible truth about Richard Blackwell and his daughters had been exposed to the light of day, and in that harsh illumination, the community found a way forward, wiser, more vigilant, and dedicated to ensuring that such silent suffering would never again go unnoticed or unaddressed. The story of the Blackwell sisters remains a painful chapter in Millfield's history, but also a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed by decades, can still be served. The truth, like the bodies in Lake Morrison, may be submerged for years, but eventually it will rise to the surface. And when it does, it brings with it the possibility of healing, of change, and of ensuring that those who were once forgotten are finally remembered. In the end, it was not sophisticated technology alone that solved the case of Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell. It was the combination of modern forensic methods with the preserved evidence from 1978. The diary entries in a teenage girl's handwriting, the weathered photographs, the employment records yellowed with age, and the memories of those who had known them. Together, these fragments from the past combined with tools of the present to reveal a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 40 years. And so the case of the Blackwell sisters was closed. But their legacy lives on in the crisis center that bears Elizabeth's name, in the cold case unit at the Millfield Police Department, in the annual scholarship awarded to a graduating senior pursuing a degree in criminal justice or social work, and in the hearts of a community that finally knows the truth about what happened on that hot July day in 1978. Justice, though long delayed, had finally been served. The truth, though painful, had finally been told. And Elizabeth and Abigail Blackwell, though they never lived to see adulthood, had finally found peace.